We are Above AIDS, and the purpose of our organization is to fight the spread of HIV/AIDS in South Africa. Our mission is to promote overall awareness of AIDS prevention and treatment methods among at-risk populations in South Africa, including women and Black Africans. Our vision is to prevent new incidences of AIDS through improved education and access to healthcare among at-risk populations. In this video, we will address the history of AIDS in South Africa and propose a timeline of solutions to achieve our mission.
Our first objective in tackling this difficult issue is to eliminate inequality in the rate at which women and Black Africans contract HIV and AIDS in South Africa. We will of course face challenges as we reach this objective, one of which is that this inequality exists because of long-standing systemic discrimination. Our solution to this is to ask the South African government for assistance because they have the ability to implement a widespread solution to systemic inequality. To measure our success with this objective, we would conduct a study to find the number of new cases in at-risk groups relative to the number of new cases in groups not at risk, possibly using incidence of HIV and AIDS per 1,000 women and per 1,000 Black Africans to collect our data. Our second objective is to control current cases and prevent new cases of HIV and AIDS by closing the healthcare gap. This would make the proper medication needed to treat and control HIV and AIDS more accessible to people living with the disease. The risk associated with this is that it would likely be costly and difficult to implement due to the lack of health-related infrastructure. We would attempt to mitigate this risk by asking for financial assistance from our implementation partners and other international organizations. An indicator of this objective would be the number of people who are virally suppressed, meaning the virus is no longer detectable in their blood. Our last objective would be to educate the population of South Africa about HIV and AIDS in order to prevent future cases. A possible complication with this objective is that it could receive pushback due to the stigma surrounding perceptions about those with HIV and AIDS. To mitigate this risk, we could work with local governments to ensure that our education programs would be implemented. An indicator of this objective would be how many people know and understand how HIV is transmitted and treated. We would collect this data through public opinion polls.
First, it's important to understand the history behind the problem that we're trying to fix. The AIDS crisis rose to prominence in the 1980s, a time when South Africa was still operating under policies of apartheid. According to the Ohio State University, Black Africans were historically more likely to have HIV/AIDS, so the largely white government did not take the crisis seriously. The government has a long history of denialist attitudes toward the prevalence of HIV and AIDS in the country. UNAIDS states that South Africa has a 20.4% prevalence rate of HIV, the third highest rate in the world. Out of those infected, women and Black Africans are more likely to have the disease. This stems both from the aforementioned apartheid policies and from historically sexist attitudes toward women. In fact, World Bank data show that the prevalence of women with HIV is 11.3%, while the prevalence of men with HIV is only 3.7%. In a country where 84% of the population relies on government aid for healthcare, it is important that the crisis is addressed sooner rather than later. This is where our organization comes in. We will work toward feasible methods of prevention, treatment, and education.
So us here at Above AIDS have come up with a 5-year timeline or plan of project implementation. So for the first year, we'll be focusing on increasing education about HIV and the risks associated with it. And we'll also be focusing on spreading awareness. We'll be doing this by adding HIV/AIDS education to the school curriculum, making health info and statistics publicly available, making public announcements with commercials, ads, brochures, and more, building relationships with organizations and companies within the healthcare industry, and lastly, creating a government program for the creation and distribution of generic drugs. Starting in year 2, we'll begin the distribution of antiviral drugs. We'll also have mass HIV/AIDS screening to inform the general public whether or not they have it. In year 3, we will be finalizing the distribution of antiviral drugs to those who need it, and we'll also be making sure that the prices on those drugs don't go up and they're still fully accessible. During year 4, We will be observing the effects of the programs implemented in years 1 through 3, and we'll be adjusting our methods to solve any problems that may have occurred or come up in the previous 3 years. Finally, in year 5, we'll be finalizing the studies and compiling data about the rates and occurrence of HIV. We'll also be ensuring that the changes we made will be sustained over time. And lastly, we'll be collecting data on a yearly basis from here on out.
Above AIDS is committed to fighting against the incidence of AIDS in disadvantaged groups through 3 avenues: prevention, treatment, and education. Although it is a difficult mission, progress can be made through a well-organized and thoughtful plan such as our own. Help us to fight HIV together.